grocery store recently, you may have noticed that the price tags for some of your purchases are significantly higher than usual. Experts have been warning for months that the empty shelves and rising food costs we started to see earlier this year would only get worse. And now, those predictions are rapidly unfolding. Americans' anxieties surrounding the health crisis and its effects on the economy have hardly diminished since the worst of the pandemic. According to a survey from the Democracy Fund and UCLA Nationscape Project, a total of 86% of citizens, including both Democrats and Republicans, reported that they were very or somewhat concerned with the pandemic. This survey was taken in mid-June amidst a turning tide of economic indicators that finally pointed towards some signs of recovery. Yet fears remained heightened. In fact, this figure was down a mere 3 percentage points from the record levels of anxiety Americans felt during late March, when the economic shutdown and lockdown measures were at their most severe. Because such fears have dominated the consumer landscape for the better part of the year, demand for basic essentials has skyrocketed. Americans have been quick to empty out stores and fill their cupboards at home, stocking up on extra non-perishable supplies in case of further stay-at-home orders or other emergencies. At the same time, food production facilities faltered, and the shattered supply chains simply could not keep up with the spike in demand. Many plants were forced to shut down their operations for weeks or even months at a time, as the health crisis affected large swathes of their workers. Outbreaks swept through the facilities because of a lack of adequate safety measures. After all, in most processing plants, every 1,000 square feet of manufacturing space is filled with 3.2 workers, a proportion that is 3 times the national average. Without sufficient spacing between employees, spread was accelerated. Of course, it is a basic economic principle that when supply rises and demand drops, prices will drive upwards. This surge in food prices was inevitable. In this video, we will discuss the dire food crisis facing the United States as prices for pantry staples surge and tens of millions of Americans remain unemployed and financially insecure. We'll also give you the devastating expert predictions on the surges in poverty and hunger that are expected to occur as a result of the economic collapse. According to recent data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, many of the staple foods that Americans fill their carts with saw a surge in price since February. The costs of beef and veal have jumped a staggering 20.2% compared to their pre-pandemic prices. Egg prices have risen by 10.4%, poultry by 8.6%, and pork by 8.5%. If this trend continues and prices keep climbing, many American households will have to undergo a dramatic shift in their diets in order to stick to their already stretched grocery budgets. For some families, basic foods like beef just won't be an affordable option anymore. According to Elaine Waxman of the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute, food costs are one of the first things people will cut back on in an economic slump. In mid-July, 30 million Americans told the U.S. Census Bureau that they did not have enough to eat. This is the highest figure on record since they began asking this question of citizens in early May. A few weeks ago, the Urban Institute published a report on food insecurity based on findings from surveys taken in mid to late May. According to their data, that month saw more than 1 in 6 adults, 17.7%, report that they had experienced food insecurity in the last 30 months. Those figures only got more dire when taking into account households that included children. More than 1 in 5 parents living with kids, 21.8%, said they had felt the effects of food insecurity. While these indicators have eased slightly since the highs recorded during March and April, the fact that they remain so high signals that the financial strain for Americans is far from over. After all, history shows that in a recession, there is a lag between surging unemployment rates and an increase in poverty. As we move into fall, the numbers will start to catch up, especially as the recovery of the U.S. labor market stalls amid new waves of virus cases and new waves of layoffs. Deepening unemployment will exacerbate the food crisis for countless Americans. The Urban Institute study found that almost 1 in every 3 low-income adults are facing food insecurity. Moreover, adults whose families had dealt with either temporary layoffs or permanent job losses suffer high rates of food insecurity, coming in at 25.3%. Households across the country have become increasingly dependent on food banks in order to make ends meet. 12.1% of adults said they had collected charitable groceries, whether from a food pantry or in the form of a free meal, in the last 30 days. According to Feeding America, the second largest charity in the U.S., 17 million people run the risk of becoming food insecure because of the ongoing health crisis. In 2018, 37 million Americans were food insecure, so the new data represents a 46% spike. Feeding America, which manages hundreds of food banks, said that the number of people who depend on such places to make ends meet has grown exponentially during the crisis. Their facilities have seen a 50% year-over-year increase in the number of people seeking assistance. Furthermore, Feeding America estimated that around 30% of those visitors were turning to such measures for the first time. Shoppers across the country have seen their grocery bills rise week after week, and prices will only continue to creep higher as the same issues with both supply chains and increased demand persist. With a dangerous combination of higher prices and lower budgets, it's no wonder so many Americans are being forced to turn to outside aid. Making matters worse, the supply side has yet to see a return to normal levels of production. Tyson Foods, the world's second largest processor and marketer of chicken, beef, and pork, as well as the largest exporter of beef in the United States, reported recently that a number of the company's facilities are still working at lower than normal production levels. Even with these dangerously high prices that have pushed millions of Americans into food insecurity, the Fed is pushing for higher inflation. Over the course of the next several months, they plan to finalize a policy that could lock in low rates for years. Fed officials have said that they would not only allow inflation above the typical 2% target, but encourage it. To that end, the Fed would withhold from raising interest rates until certain goals for inflation and employment are achieved. Currently, inflation hovers around 1%, and the unemployment rate is among the highest on record, so it could take quite a while for them to hit their targets. Meanwhile, the second wave of layoffs is set to push the U.S. economy deeper into a recession as the health crisis drags on and a second stimulus package stalls in Congress. According to a survey carried out by Cornell University and RIWI during the last week of July, nearly a third of workers who were added back onto payrolls after initial layoffs in March and April had recently been laid off for a second time. An additional 25% of rehired employees reported that they were told their time at work could be limited and that future rounds of layoffs may occur. It has been common knowledge for weeks now that millions of jobs lost earlier in the pandemic would never return to the economy. But this latest data flies in the face of more positive jobs reports in May and June that said employment opportunities were speedily returning. Optimistic indicators mean nothing if those very jobs that are supposedly returning will just disappear again. And when skyrocketing food prices collide with countless Americans that are no longer receiving regular paychecks nor the federal unemployment benefits that acted as a lifeline to stave off poverty, the result will be catastrophic. Remember the images that surfaced earlier this year of food bank lines that stretched for miles? it is seeming more and more likely that we will continue to see scenes like these for the rest of 2020 and beyond. Of course, when looking at other parts of the globe, the US isn't even suffering the worst of it, at least not yet. Massive swarms of locusts, with up to 80 million insects in a single group, have covered portions of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, where they destroy valuable agricultural areas and much-needed crops. The World Economic Forum reported that one swarm, measuring a square kilometer in size, can consume as much food in one day as 35,000 people. More recently, these locust swarms moved into southern Russia, inflicting damage on local agriculture there that will cost upwards of $13 million. Furthermore, contributing to the rise in pork prices, African swine fever has wiped out almost 1/4 of the world's pig population. And the bad news for the world's food supply just keeps coming. Approximately 1/3 of China has been devastated by extreme flooding as rainfall pounds the southern part of the country. The disaster has wiped out an estimated 11.27 million acres of agricultural land, as well as nearly 1,000 homes. All in all, the damage thus far will cost upwards of $929 million. Rice, wheat, other staple crops that are in high demands among the domestic population were among those heavily affected by the flooding. Now, the world's second largest economy is joining many other nations in its deepening food crisis. China is in possession of over 50% of global wheat inventories and serves as the second largest producer of wheat after the EU. It also holds 65% of global corn inventories and serves as the second largest producer of corn after the United States. Damage to China's vital supplies will ricochet across the wider international economy as well, driving us all into deeper food insecurity. Even during much more stable periods, large portions of the world suffer from food shortages and widespread hunger. The World Food Programme reported that in 2019, 821 million people were food insecure and 149 million of them suffered crisis-level hunger or worse. This year, those numbers have spiked dramatically. Updated predictions say that the number of people experiencing crisis-level hunger may reach as many as 270 million in 2020 as a direct result of the pandemic, and that's an 80% increase year over year. As global food supply chains continue to rupture, now is the time to stock up on essential items before prices only drive even further upwards. But unfortunately, tens of millions of Americans no longer have the funds to do so, as there is no money to be seen, not through employment and not through federal assistance. If you want to prepare for the economic fallout ahead, check out additional work by Michael Snyder, publisher of the Economic Collapse blog, and of The American Dream, and the most important news. Snyder's articles can be found on dozens of other prominent websites worldwide, and he is the author of 4 books available on Amazon.com, including The Beginning of the End, Get Prepared Now, and Living a Life That Really Matters. Even last year, before news of a massive recession and dire health crisis dominated the headlines, Snyder was already anticipating the disaster that would befall the United States and the economic conditions that were building towards a perfect storm of total societal devastation. Now, his shocking predictions are unfolding as the US and the world spiral further into chaos.